Hi, everyone. We have a lot to talk about today, so I'll try to make it as brief but as factual as I can. We're going to start with Constantine, the great emperor who lived in the early 4th century, and the Roman Church. And then we're going to talk about the migrations of various peoples that the Romans referred to as barbarians in the 5th and 6th centuries. I always say there are 2 centuries that you should be really glad you missed in European history. The 3rd century is one, the 14th is another. We'll get to the 14th later. But the 3rd century was a very difficult and painful century for the Roman Empire. What happened was that in 235 CE, an emperor died who was the member of a dynasty called the Severan Emperors. And there was no obvious person to succeed him in this position. So chaos broke out in 235 CE, and between 235 and 284, there were numerous small civil wars with lots and lots of different candidates trying to take control of the Roman Empire by using their armies. So there are 50 men in that 50-year period between 218 and 268. 50 different people claim to be emperor. Almost none of them are on the official list of emperors. And in the year 238 alone, there were 7 men. You can also look at the fact at the bottom of the page there, of the 37 emperors of the 3rd century, 17 left office by being murdered. This was a very violent and difficult time. In order to take care of some of that, the Emperor Diocletian, who lived in the late 3rd century, decided to split the empire up so that it would be easier to govern and easier to keep peaceful. Now, he made a line down the center of the empire, dividing the Greek-speaking from the Latin-speaking world, and he appointed 2 senior rulers who were going to be called Augusti, okay, and 2 junior rulers called Caesars for each side of the empire. The way this was supposed to work was that the Augusti would rule for 5 years, and they would step down in favor of their Caesars. The Caesars would become Augusti, and then they would pick new Caesars. Now, this recognized the difference between the Greek and the Latin-speaking world, which was already there, but it also was a brilliant solution to the decentralization of the empire. So here's a map that shows the Roman Empire in about 285 or so. And the line went right down the middle here, with the Greek-speaking side on this side and the Latin-speaking side on the other side. Now, during this time, the Christian church was growing exponentially, and it was going to need some more leadership. Now, unfortunately, there was no leadership coming out of Judea at that point. The Romans had brutally suppressed a Judean revolt in the year 72 CE, and there was no forceful Christian leadership coming out of that part of the Roman Empire. So since St. Peter was traditionally the first bishop of Rome and one of Jesus's close friends, the bishops of Rome began gradually to become the most important bishops in the empire. Their title is Pope or Papa. Papa just means daddy, right? Father of the church. Now, this was backed up by a particular scripture, which is the book of Matthew, chapter 16, verse 18. Thou art Peter, and I will give thee the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So that's the basis for the idea that, first of all, that the Roman bishop is the most important bishop in the church, and also the root of the legend that St. Peter stands at the pearly gates and lets people in or does not let people into heaven. Here he is over here. If you want to find him in art, you can always find him holding some keys. And the keys are here. They're sort of large and they look a little bit like feathers, but they're keys. Gradually, the structure of the Christian church is going to grow. It is going to include many, many different positions and many, many different levels. So the Pope at the top, followed by some important church officials who are called cardinals. We'll talk about them later. Archbishops, who rule over bishops, and bishops who rule over priests, monks, and other clergy. And the bulk of the people who work for the Christian church are in that bottom category. And of course, there's only one person at the top, who is the Pope. So this is a very hierarchical structure. In other words, there are very few people at the top and many people at the bottom. Now, none of that would have made any difference if Constantine, the emperor from 312 to 337, had not made it legal to practice Christianity in the empire. You might remember from last time that Christians were being persecuted and it was actually illegal to be a Christian in the early empire. Constantine claimed the title of Augustus in 306. He marched out of Britain towards Rome to fight with the emperor who was currently in power there, a guy whose name was Maximianus. He defeated the Western Emperor in 312 and the Eastern Emperor in 324, thus ending the structure that Diocletian had put together, and also making himself the Augustus over the entire empire once more. The key battle where this took place is a place called the Milvian Bridge. So the Battle of the Milvian Bridge is basically the story that you read in your document for today. We'll talk about the document in class. So in 312, Constantine passed a series of documents called the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity legal in the empire. It was now possible to be a Christian. The conversion spread even more rapidly at that point because people who were not worried about being martyred could become Christians. It's not until the end of the 4th century when an emperor called Theodosius I makes Christianity the official religion of the empire, and pagan religions and Roman state religion are no longer tolerated at that point. Constantine put his finger into a lot of religious pies in the 4th century. One of the important ones was a particular church council called in 325 CE, called the Council of Nicaea. The dispute at the Council of Nicaea had to do with the relationship between God and Jesus. Some people argued that Jesus and God were the same. Some people argued that Jesus was subordinate to God. This is a sort of abstruse theological argument that I think bothers basically no one in the 21st century, but it was big news in the 4th century. So the Council of Nicaea was called to make a decision about this point. Were God and Jesus identical, or was Jesus supported, a supporter of God, but not actually God? There were two people arguing at that point. A bishop called Athanasius, who we'll meet later, and a priest named Arius, and there's his name down there at the bottom of the slide. Arius backed the losing side. The council decided that Jesus and God were in fact the same entity, which is the foundation of what eventually will be the doctrine of the Trinity for those of you who grew up in religious households. Arius, because he disagreed with this point, became the first heretic of the Christian church. And he has a lot of influence over people who are becoming Christian, particularly in the Eastern Empire. So when we do our documents, we will read a document called the Nicene Creed, and that will teach us a little bit about what the Christian church was trying to teach at this point. And we can talk a little bit about whether it was successful or not. Now, meanwhile, even before the 3rd century and all of the craziness that was going on in that century, new peoples were migrating into the Roman Empire, and they were in some ways welcomed and in other ways not welcome at all. We sort of refer to these groups as Germanic simply because they were speaking languages that are related to modern German. So there's a lot of them. We don't know very much about what they called themselves or how they organized their society, particularly not in the 4th and 5th centuries, because they left us no sources, and Romans left us sources, but as you can imagine, Romans were definitely on the outside of this society looking in, so it's hard to trust them when they say things about these peoples. These societies were kin and clan based. So we would call them, in a way, tribal societies. You were closest to your extended kinship group if you were a member of these societies. And many of the tribes are basically large clans, that is, groups of families who travel together and work together. It is a largely oral culture, that is, people pass on their knowledge orally, they're not writing things down. And there was no hereditary kingship in these groups. The chieftain was chosen for his skill in war, and there was a lively warrior culture between these different groups of people. Now, the Romans lumped them under the general category of barbarians. And barbari, which in Latin means barbarians, basically means people whose language sounds like bar, 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 bar. Right. So it doesn't come with any of the freight that you might think in terms of like Conan the Barbarian or, hairy people with wearing animal skins, but rather that these people were not members of Roman culture and therefore were barbarians. Here are some groups. This is not the kind of thing I would ever test you on. But what I would like you to look at is, okay, so here's one decade, the 250s. Two groups called the Goths and the Alemanni were entering Roman territory at that time. In the 260s, there are 3 groups. In the 270s, there are three groups. A particularly important and large group is called the Visigoths. We'll talk a little bit more about them. They sacked Rome in 410, which was a tremendously big deal. The Vandals, from whom we get the word vandalism in the 5th century, and the Huns, who are arguably the toughest of any of these groups to defeat, starting in 372 and going on through the 5th century. Now, the reason that I mention all these different names to you is because I'd like you to see how these waves of people continually pushing on the Roman frontier cause the 3rd century to be even more complicated than it was just simply because of the problems with the emperors. This is going to do a couple of things to Roman society. Right? So in this particular map, we can see all of these. Oh, for some reason, this thing does not want to draw. Okay, there we go. So all of these peoples, that's not much of an arrow, sorry about that, are moving out of this part of the steppes of Russia and are moving down this direction. And that pushes on the peoples who are living here, and those peoples begin to push into Roman territory. You can see a group called the Alemanni here have made a real inroad into Roman territory, and they're going to continue to do that. Over here, the Huns are pushing on the Greek-speaking side of the empire, right? Pressing down in the direction of what is eventually going to be Constantinople. Right? So all the time this chaos is going on in the 3rd century, there are also groups of people migrating into the empire who don't know about any of the problems that are within the Roman government and basically really don't care, except that they're looking for safe places to settle and to make new lives. So the Romans had to figure out a way to deal with these people. And one way to do that was to allow them into the territory as what was called federates. So if you were federated, that means that you were under the protection of the Roman government, but not a part of Roman society. The Emperor Julian in 358 federated the Franks, and this is the group that is eventually going to found France, as you can probably figure out. The Emperor Valens in the year 376 allows the Visigoths onto Roman territory and settles them in a federated camp. These people are incorporated then into the Roman military. They're freely recruited for Roman military service. But the people that they left behind in particularly Visigothic territory were not doing very well at all. They were settled on land which was in really terrible for growing crops. And the other problem was that these peoples were nomadic peoples. They were cattle and sheep and goat herders. They were not used to stopping and making farming large tracts of land. So the Visigoths in particular began to become very hungry. They had a terrible harvest season, and they began to eat their animals and eventually to eat any animal they could get their hands on. They were very hungry. The children were getting sick. And so the Visigoths decided to revolt. So they left the land that the Romans had made them stay on and rampaged up and down the Roman continent for several decades. Many different generals were sent out to try to suppress them, and all of this is going on here at the very end of the 4th century. In 410, they sacked the city of Rome, and the city of Rome was sacked very rarely in the ancient world. There's a sack by the Celts back in the Roman Republic. But this was the first time in anybody's experience that Rome had been sacked, and it was a tremendous blow to the spirit of the Roman people. What ended up happening after the revolt of the Visigoths was that gradually Germanic generals, so leaders of these various Germanic groups, began to seize power in Rome. Now, it was still an empire at this point, so you needed an emperor. But the German generals did not want anyone on the imperial throne that could interfere with what they were doing. So what happens is that there are now Germanic kings in control of Rome, but there are still some emperors present. And we call these guys the puppet emperors. There are 5 and 10 years. You can see the years there. In 476, a king named Odoacer deposes the last of the Roman emperors, a guy whose name was Romulus Augustulus, and became king of Italy. In 489, a Visigoth named Theodoric defeated Odoacer and became king of Italy, and Italy became a kingdom, and it became separate from all the other parts of the Roman Empire. So Rome was no longer Roman in the way that we are accustomed to think of it. This begins what we refer to as the early Middle Ages. So in this particular map, you can see that the Western Empire has broken up into kingdoms. The Visigoths have a kingdom here in southern France and Spain. This is Ostrogoths under Odoacer. Right? There are Burgundians, and there's a Roman general who has a little kingdom up here in northern France called the Kingdom of Syagrius. The Franks are settled here in what's now which is now France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Now, meanwhile, the Eastern Empire, which was the Greek-speaking side of the empire, was still in one piece. You can see all this pink here is the Eastern Empire. And at this point, the power of the Roman Empire moved from Rome to the city of Constantinople, which is right here on the tip of this isthmus. So there's some conversation among historians about whether Rome really fell or not. It was definitely sacked in 410 by the Visigoths, but whether the empire itself fell or moved is a question that many historians have asked. If you look at this map, you can find a rationale for either yes, the empire fell, or no, the empire did not fall, depending on whether you think the fall of Rome is functionally the fall of the entire empire. This is a little bit later in the 476 era here. The Franks become a major kingdom, and this is eventually going to be France, and as you can see, a whole bunch of other countries as well. The Visigoths have moved down here into Spain. And there are a bunch of little areas in the Western Empire that are covered by pink. So there was some effort by an emperor whose name is Justinian to retake the western part of the empire. But in general, what's left of the Roman Empire has broken up into major kingdoms. So if you want to say that the Roman Empire fell, this map is a good way to argue that. Right. Okay, that is it for now. Please bring your questions to class, and feel free to ask me any other questions that you might have by email or give me a call.